The year after the release of Dracula and Frankenstein, the writer-director Robert Fleury submitted a script for a werewolf movie that would serve as a new monster vehicle for Boris Karloff. This project wouldn't get off the ground, but the young head of Universal at the time, Junior Lemley, never forgot about it. After the 1933 publication of Guy Andor's The Werewolf of Paris, Lemley tried again with another original script, this time by journeyman writer John Colton, that would get made into 1935's Werewolf of London. Ah woo. While financially successful in its day, it came and went without making much of an impact. It's not a bad movie, but it does have some pacing issues and weird tonal shifts alongside a largely unsympathetic portrayal of the main character, a wolf-cursed botanist, by stage actor Henry Hull. Werewolf of London does have the distinction of being the first full-length feature film to deal with werewolf folklore, but it would be greatly overshadowed a few years later, in 1941, after the Universal classic monsters renaissance began with Son of Frankenstein. It was then that another original script was commissioned, big-name actors were hired, and the Wolfbane began to bloom.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms.
Larry Talbot has returned home after over a decade abroad to reconnect with his grieving father and reclaim his place in his noble family's legacy. While there, he tries to save a woman from a brutal assault by a wolf, only to find himself transforming into something inexplicable, what local folklore calls a werewolf. His scientific father refuses to accept the superstitions, but with each passing night, the body count rises and the truth becomes harder to escape. Larry Talbot has become a monster.
After only a few short years of directing B-pictures like Mystery Plane, Wolf Call, and Man-Made Monster, the one-time silent movie actor George Wagoner decided to try his hand at producing. His first project was The Wolfman, which he would also direct. Though Universal was perfectly content to dust off the Robert Fleury script from nearly a decade earlier and once again make it a vehicle for Karloff, Wagoner went ahead and assigned the scriptwriter Kurt Siodmak, who had already had success with Universal horror films like The Invisible Man Returns and Black Friday. Siodmak was a recent emigre from Germany, having fled the Nazis due to his Jewish heritage. But let's put that aside for later, when it will be more relevant. For now, the important thing to note is that Siodmak, after throwing out the Fleury script wholesale, spent 5 months researching various werewolf myths and legends. He wound up making his own mythology, much of which would later become the basic rules of lycanthropy we still think of today, even inventing his own little poem that is repeated 3 times in the first act.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
Many sources, including Siodmak himself, play up how much he actually invented, but he's gotten a little too much retroactive credit, given that some of the rules he allegedly invented do predate him, such as the werewolf curse being transmitted by a bite, and the idea that silver is the only thing that can reliably kill one. His script also has more than a few similarities to Werewolf of London. Ahoo! Nevertheless, Siodmak did manage to find the perfect formula for how to make a werewolf movie, though his script does differ from the final film in a couple of key ways. For instance, the main character, Larry, is unrelated to Lord Talbot in the script, and the script leans more heavily on ambiguity, never actually showing the monster except in a possibly hallucinogenic reflection. Still, the core of Siodmak's story is intact, and he absolutely deserves credit for setting the mold from which all future werewolf movies would be cast. Hey, do you have a sci-fi classic you want me to cover? Drop it down in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to support what I do even more, please consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. If you still haven't gotten enough of me, I'm also the co-host of a couple of different podcasts, The Streaming Heap and From Here to Paternity, which are available wherever you get your podcasts, and I have a novel called Paradox that is available through Amazon. If all else fails, though, you can always check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more science fiction classics in both film and literature. Now then, with all that shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's move on. While Siodmak was still working on his script, and before the story had even been fleshed out, the cast was almost completely settled. Though Karloff had been the intended star for the conceptual stages of the project, his schedule was full of Broadway performances at the time. So, in his absence, Bela Lugosi stepped in and lobbied hard to get the part. A few years earlier, after his career began to rebound in the wake of Son of Frankenstein, Lugosi had tried to get another werewolf script off the ground called The Howling Death, but it had gone nowhere. For the Wolfman, Bela did manage to land a part, but rather than the lead, he plays a tiny but significant role as the gypsy werewolf, also named Bela, who infects the main character. To actually play the lead, Wagner instead opted for an up-and-coming Lon Chaney, son of the legendary silent film actor of the same name. I won't go into too much depth on Lon Chaney Jr. because I don't want to be here all day, but he had entered the acting business a decade prior, following the untimely death of Lon Chaney Sr. His real name was Creighton Chaney, but as he struggled to get an acting career off the ground, he gave himself his father's name. It didn't seem to help at first, and as the 1940s approached, he was considered something of a joke in the industry. Then he had a breakthrough performance as Lenny, in both the stage and film versions of Mice and Men, after which Universal gave him a starter contract and the lead in Man-Made Monster, which was directed by George Wagner, no doubt leading to his casting as the Wolfman, Larry Talbot. Lon Chaney Jr. made the role his own, injecting a level of pathos even greater than Karloff had done for Frankenstein's monster, and he would go on to reprise the role for every single sequel, being the only classic monster actor to do so. Despite a reputation for being warm and kind, there was plenty of tension on set involving Chaney. He and legendary makeup man Jack Pierce didn't get along. In later Wolfman films, they would mutually refuse to work with one another, and he also didn't get along with his female co-star, Evelyn Ankers. Ankers, who plays Gwen, had her own troubled history, acting only because her mother forced her into it, and she didn't like the idea of doing a horror film. Add to that the fact that she'd spent the last couple of years unlearning her British accent, only to be told to turn it back on for the movie, and she was reportedly pretty miserable, in no mood to put up with Chaney's behind-the-scenes practical jokes and barely controlled alcoholism. To play Larry's father, the Lord Talbot, they hired the great Claude Rains, who after getting his film start as the titular Invisible Man, was reluctant to return to the horror genre. However, he had become a well-respected actor following his performances in The Adventures of Robin Hood and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the latter of which earned him an Academy Award nomination. Despite the suspension of disbelief required to accept that he could be the father of the relatively hulking Lon Chaney Jr., it is worth noting that in reality, Lon Chaney Sr. was about the same height as Claude Rains. As for Bela's mother, the gypsy woman Maleva, she is played by the incomparable Maria Uspenskaya, a Russian immigrant who had made quite a name for herself as one of the most formidable acting coaches in all of Hollywood, earning multiple Academy Award nominations of her own for Dodsworth and Love Affair, and helping to launch the careers of many younger superstars.
The way you walked was thorny, through no fault of your own.
Other notable actors include prolific character actor J.M. Kerrigan as Gwen's father. He had also appeared in Werewolf of London, Ahoo, the OG Perry Mason, Warren William as Dr. Lloyd, the Invisible Man's Forrester Harvey as Twiddle, Ralph Bellamy as Captain Monford, and Patrick Knowles as Frank. There is one other important actor who deserves mention. When the gypsy Bela turns into a wolf, the character is then played by Moose, a trained police dog who was being used by studio security at the time. Even though the dog injured his hand pretty severely, Lon Chaney, a noted animal lover, adopted Moose, after which the two were apparently inseparable. Filming began in late October of 1941 under the working title Destiny, a title used for several 1940s Universal horror films. Jack Pierce's makeup was an updated version of the makeup he had originally designed for Werewolf of London, which wasn't ultimately used in that film. Pierce stuck to his usual cotton and collodion technique, supplementing them with a rubber nose piece and a whole lot of yak hair. The application took between 4 and 5 hours, with removal requiring another hour or two. Still, you never really get a good look at it in the final film, as the Wolfman only appears in moonlight. There was one sequence that was at least partially filmed in which Larry Talbot, in human form, wrestles with a bear at the carnival. During filming, the bear got spooked and began threatening cast and crew, even chasing poor Evelyn Ankers up a ladder. Nobody was hurt, but the scene was cut from the film. It does, however, make a brief appearance in the film's trailers. The Wolfman released on December 9, 1941, just 2 days following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Critics were lukewarm on it, but it did earn a very healthy box office return, ensuring that Larry Talbot would join the ranks of Dracula and Frankenstein's monster during the following years' heydays of horror. It also finally silenced the giggles that had followed Lon Chaney, proving the actor's ability to turn a profit with an earnest performance. And his career entered a golden age in the Wolfman's wake. He had some serious ups and downs and struggles with alcohol, including an attempt on his own life at one point, but he found steady work in film and television until his death in 1973. But the Wolfman was, in his own words, his baby, and it remains one of the most recognizable and popular of the Universal classic monsters. Unlike Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy, though, the Wolfman has never gotten a satisfactory modern iteration. Sure, it almost single-handedly defined the werewolf mythos used in hundreds of movies throughout the years, but a true successor to Larry Talbot has never been found. There have been attempts, most notably Universal's middling 2010 remake with Benicio del Toro, but it has proven thus far to be impossible to replace Lon Chaney in the title role. I also don't think there are many werewolf movies as thematically dense and interesting as 1941's The Wolfman. There are many ways to read the film, from a Kantian take on the bestial nature of man, something explored in Jack Nicholson's Wolf, to a subtextual discussion of puberty, made more explicit in Teen Wolf. And though there have been many good werewolf movies like that to explore these ideas, none seems capable of tackling them all simultaneously as well as the original. But there are two ways to read The Wolfman that I really want to talk about, and which aren't as well covered by other cinematic Wolfmen. The first relates back to Kurt Siodmak's history as a Jewish immigrant from Germany in the 1930s, during the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. The writer has described feeling beset by forces intent on destroying him, seeing people, friends even, radicalized into monsters, for no readily apparent reason outside of the accident of his birth and his religious affiliations. Unfortunately, you don't have to look very far to see modern examples of this very phenomenon.
One of the worst and most visible displays of anti-Jewish hatred occurred in Sydney, Australia, where 1,000 pro-Palestinian protesters shouted "gas" and "F the Jews."
This is a very heavy subtext in the film, practically offered up on a silver platter by the obvious symbolism of somebody being marked for death by a star. Larry is an outsider, even more so in Siodmak's original script, who was given this curse by another outsider. And it is this abject fear of otherness that drives him to the brink of total madness and ultimately results in his death at the hands of his own father. And that relates to the second reading I want to discuss, and that comes from the perspective of psychology. While the discipline still had a ways to go to become what we would now recognize as a legitimate medical science, the foundations of modern psychology had already been laid by 1941. Siodmak was himself a student of Freud, and his use of psychology in The Wolfman holds up surprisingly well. The Wolfman is, at its heart, an allegory for mental illness, of forces beyond an individual's control or understanding that make him or her behave in ways contrary to their will, resulting in their descent into both stigmatization and crime, which in this case includes murder. As I said, there's other ways to look at the movie too. At a stretch, you could say it's an allegory for sexually transmitted disease in the wake of premarital infidelity, Or you could argue that the movie is about how the inevitable world war was going to turn a bunch of young men into sacrificial murderers. I'm really just scratching the surface here, but you get the idea. That's why this movie, more than any of the other Universal classic monster movies, holds a special place in my estimation. It is easily the deepest and most profoundly human monster of them all, surpassing the simple pathos of Frankenstein's monster, the sexual sadism of Dracula, the megalomania of the Invisible Man, and the corpse-cold revenge of the Mummy, while still retaining properties of each. It's also the one with the most poignant and disturbing ending, an almost nihilistic conclusion in which the monster is indeed killed, but so is the innocence of an entire town. None of this is meant to take away from any of those other monster movies, as they each have different virtues not easily dismissed. I even still stand by my assertion that The Invisible Man is my personal favorite, and I still have Karloff's monster framed on my office wall. But The Wolfman could easily stand alone and be considered a horror classic in its own right, a template that has been used many times since, but never really improved upon. And that's all for this year's spooky season, my dear mortals. What's your favorite werewolf movie, aside from The Wolfman? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, give those like and subscribe buttons a good knock with your cane. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll hijack a map of history itself, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not going to kill it when the wolfbane blooms. Ahoo, werewolves of London. Ahoo!